our thickness or surface planer in our shop. This is called a 16.5-inch planer because the blades, or the widest piece of wood that I can send through, is about 16.5 inches wide. The uses for a planer are many. Usually it's to reduce a board's thickness or to get rid of saw marks, burn marks. Eventually in our Woods 1 class and in our Woods 2 class, we build things that look like a face frame here. And we want these edges on the face frame to come out really sharp and clean without having any saw marks or burns. And quite often when we cut things on the table saw, we'll be left with burn marks. Like you can see by this knot, there's a burn. Or if you look real close, you can see saw marks. And if you can't see the saw marks right away, once you put the clear coat and stain on there, you'll be able to see them. That becomes pretty obvious. So we want to make sure that we clean all that stuff off. So we typically, on a face frame, we'll cut pieces bigger, maybe 1/8 of an inch bigger, and then we'll run the edges through the planer. So if I want this board to be 2 inches wide, I'll cut it at 2 1/8. That way I can make a pass to the planer at 2 1/16, and then a pass to the planer at 2, and I've got a board with really nice clean edges on it. When we are planing on a planer, we never want to take more than 1/8 of an inch off at a time. It's not so much that the planer can't handle it, it's that your board can't handle it. When we start taking more than 1/8 of an inch off at a time, we start tearing the wood instead of giving it a nice clean cut, which can be a problem. Even though 1/8 of an inch is the maximum cut that we can make, so if I've got to take this board and make it a 1/2 of an inch thick, if I've got to take 1/4 of an inch off, I can make 2 passes at 1/8 of an inch to get those off. But if I want this to look good and have a really nice surface finish, I want to stay in about the 1/16 of an inch range. So whatever the max is on a machine, about half of that is where we want to do most of our everyday cutting. That's going to work out better for a board, and it's not going to overtax our machine, and it's going to last a lot longer. Number 2, the stock should be at least 12 inches long. There's a lot of similarities between the planer and the time saver, which we'll see in a moment, but the planer and the time saver both have this 12-inch rule. And what's helpful on the top of the planer is that we've got these 2 silver rollers that are about 12 inches apart. So if your board can be supported by both of those rollers, you're good to go sending it through the planer. Now the reason we've got to have a 12-inch rule is that directly underneath of these rollers are wheels. That's what pulls our machine, or pulls our product through the machine. And those wheels being about 12 inches apart, if our board is shorter than that, the front wheel is going to pull it through, but it's not going to be long enough to get picked up by the back wheel, and it's going to get stuck in the middle. Number 3, always plane with the grain. Never attempt to plane across the grain. So with the grain, I'm going to run my board through this way or this way. Even if this isn't going to fit, but even if it could fit, I would never want to run it through across the grain. The planer really does a bad job of leaving a nice surface cut when we run across the grain. The time saver can do that, but we don't want to do that on the planer. Number 4, surface only new dried lumber that is free of loose knots and serious defects. I'm not sure if you can see this from where you're at, but somebody ran construction lumber through here pretty recently, and construction lumber's got a lot of moisture in it. You can see it's rusted the top of the table here, and that has just been a couple days since somebody has done that. We've always got to make sure that we don't run wet lumber that maybe you have a tree that fell down in your backyard and you want to make coasters or something out of it. We can't run that through some of these machines because it's got such a high moisture content. So we want to have new dry lumber that's free of loose knots and serious defects. Loose knots come out of here like hockey pucks, so we got to make sure that we don't have a bunch of loose knots. On our knotty alder, we have knots in it, but these knots aren't loose. If I poke that knot, it's not going to come all the way out. Number 5, stand to one side of the work being fed through the machine. We want to put our board in off to the side. I don't want to stand directly in front of the machine because I'm going to bear the brunt of whatever gets thrown out of that machine. Number 6, do not get your finger pinched between the piece of wood and the table on the planer or wide belt sander. So what we're saying is we never want to hold our board like this and run it through, because my fingers can get pinched between the board and the table. We always hold things by the edge so that if it comes out of our hand and we're not expecting it, it can just come out of our hands. Our fingers aren't getting pinched underneath of it. Number 7, if the machine is not working or sounding proper, shut the power off and let me know. Your ears are going to be a really good indicator that something in here is not working well. You may not understand exactly what it is that's not working, but your ears are really going to be helpful, and we want to make sure that you're paying attention to the way things are sounding. Number 8, if need be, an operator can work with a partner to help catch the wood on the outfeed table. Let's pretend this board was really long. I want somebody to help support this on the back side of the machine. The reason being is those wheels that hold my board down and run them through have big springs on the top of it. When I get a big long board, that acts like a lever, and it doesn't take a very thick board to be so heavy that it can overpower the springs of those rollers that are holding my board down. And when that happens, my board comes up into the cutter and I start getting what's called snipe on the end. So if I want to cut this at 2 inches, what'll happen is it'll start out just fine at 2 inches, but by the end it's overpowering the springs. So now my board's 1 7/8 instead of 2 inches at the very end of it. So we got to make sure that we're supporting the board on either side so we're not overpowering the springs on the machine. Number 9, be sure there's enough space for the board to run through the planer before putting the piece into the planer. We got to make sure that there's not stuff back here, somebody's projects, or if you're at home and you have a planer, we want to make sure that there's not a wall there that's going to tip the planer over, because the planer is going to want to keep feeding the board through. The planer is one of those machines that we want to have the dust collector on to use it, otherwise it makes a mess. I've got the dust collector off right now, and you'll see that even just taking an edge off of here will leave quite a sawdusty mess. There is a post right here with a black and a silver tape measure on there. Black is the inches, silver is metric. We'll use inches in here, and so whatever the indicator is pointing to on the black side of the tape is how thick your board is going to come out. So if I've got a board that's 3 inches wide and I set this to 2 inches, this machine is going to try to take an inch off. So we've got to make sure that we set it properly. So this board right now is at 2 1/8, and I want to get it to 2 inches. So I'm going to set this at 2 1/16. Now I've got it set at 2 1/16, and I'll turn it on. If I don't change the setup on my next pass, I'm going to get marks on here. So you'll see this as I run it through. You hear it's not cutting anything off. And I'm left with all these bumps. Now these bumps are because that front roller, that is not a smooth roller. Think of it like an octagon. It's got a lot more sides than an octagon, but that digs into the board so the board can't get thrown out of the machine. Every turn on this wheel is a 1/16 of an inch. So at minimum, I gotta take a 30-second off, or I'm gonna wind up with these lines. So if you get these lines, it means you're not taking enough material off. It's easy to fix though. I'll turn it on, go a half a turn, those lines are gone. Now I'm at 2 1/32. So I can only go half a turn. I'll flip it over. And now I have a board that's got 2 nice square edges. And you can see, even that little bit without the dust collector on made a pretty good mess. That concludes the rules on the planer. Now we're going to head over to the time saver. Again, a lot of similarities. This cuts with knives, that cuts with sandpaper. As we move over to the time saver, there's a lot of similarities between the time saver and the planer, but there's also some differences. The biggest difference is this uses sandpaper to achieve the cut or the thinning of the material, whereas the planer used the knives. And so when we start using sandpaper instead of knives, we've got to be careful with how much we're taking off. This is also a much bigger, more powerful machine that's got some possibilities of us getting hurt. So our first safety rule that we want to talk about is the emergency stop. Number 10 says, on the time saver, do not use the emergency stop as the normal shutdown. We have several emergency stops on the time saver. The main one that people tend to gravitate towards using is this one right here. We've also got one over here, and there's 2 on the back side of the time saver. Don't use those just to shut down when you're done using. Use those if there's an emergency. Maybe a belt tears or breaks. Maybe your shirt is caught on the piece of material going through, or maybe your material is too thick. There's also an emergency stop that you're not going to be able to see, but under here there is a gate that swings freely, and if that gate is pushed up, maybe you're trying to send a board that's too thick through, or maybe there's a big warp in the board, it's going to turn the machine off. Please don't rely on those to turn the machine off when you're done. That's like using your parking brake or your emergency brake in your car every time you come to a stoplight. There are two red buttons here. This is the first, the head stop and the feed stop. Use these two as a normal shutdown when you're done cutting or sanding on the time saver. Number 11, if the belt breaks, turn off the machine immediately. Inside the time saver is a very large belt. Ours is 43 inches wide, and if we tore it in half, it would be 5 feet long. You can see this one comes out. This one is getting a little bit worn. We've got new belts that we can put in. But if this should break, there'll be very little doubt as you're using the machine that the belt broke, because it'll be a loud, obnoxious noise, and it'll sound like you got a flat tire on your car. If that belt breaks, please hit the stop. Number 12, we've got a wheel here that if we turn it, it will move the table up and down on the time saver. We only want to turn that dial 10 thousandths, 0.010 of an inch every time, every turn. That's 2 to 3 thicknesses of a human hair. So we're going real fine-tune adjustments here. And in a moment when we power this up, you'll see that there's also a motor that we can use to control the up and down of that. But if you're going manually, you'll see a readout here. We only want to go 10 thousandths of an inch per pass. So an example of pass 1 could be 0.840, pass 2, 0.830, pass 3, 0.820. If we take more than that off, we wreck our belts, and it happens pretty quickly, especially if we're using a finishing belt. Number 13 talks about using a glue scraper. On this board, this is 3 pieces of wood glued together. This is a really common example for using the time saver. We want to make sure that we use a glue scraper and scrape off any dried glue that's on our board before we send it through the time saver. You'll also notice we call it time saver. That is the trade name for it. So Time Savers is the company that invented the wide belt sander, actually right over here in Maple Grove. There's now probably hundreds of companies that make time savers. The actual term is wide belt sander. Everybody calls it a time saver. It's like calling a tissue a Kleenex. That brand name has just stuck, and even though lots of companies make it, Time Saver still is one of the better ones. And number 14, only turn the height adjustment wheel 0.010 every pass. I put it in there twice so that you're certain to not take off more than you can, because that will wreck a belt faster than just about anything on this machine, and it's by far the most common mistake students make. Okay, to operate this, I'm going to get some of this stuff out of the way. We have on here the directions to operate the time saver. I'm going to read through them. Part of the directions are being able to read a caliper. Tape measures are still used in wood manufacturing, but these are becoming more popular than tape measures. Most of our equipment in the next 5 years will have digital readouts on it. Digital readout is here. The planer actually has one that we don't use, but if you remember back to the miter saw, that's got one. And our table saw is hopefully going to get one here in the next year or two. But our big machines that are our precision machines are going to have digital readouts, and that's going to force us to start using calipers instead of tape measures for a lot of the things that we measure in the shop. And this is no exception. We need to know the thickness of our board. We know that they typically come from the mill at about 0.830, but just because they typically come that size doesn't mean we can count on it. So we have to use one of these to measure the thickness of our board. Just real quickly, to use one of these, you're going to see lots of graduations on here. You're going to see a 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 2, and so on. You read the first two decimals on the bar. So if my reading is right here, I can see that I'm at the 0. I'm not to the 1 inch mark yet, so I'm at point, 0 point, and then I'm in between the 7 and the 8. So I'm at 0.7, and then my last two numbers are on the dial here. 0.701 is where this one would be at right now. If you've got more questions on that, or that wasn't enough explanation, that's fine. There's a QR code right here that you can scan with your phone. That will bring you to a close-up view and a little better explanation for how to use the caliper. So I need to figure out how thick my board is. I'm at 0.75 right now. So this board has already been sanded a few times to 0.750. Please put this back up here in case that you can just set it on. That's important. So now that we know how thick our board is, that's going to be the first pass that we make. Our first pass really just kind of zeroes everything out so we know the thickness of our board. We don't have any surprises. So now I'm going to turn this on. And to turn this on, I first have to turn the control power on. And then I have to turn the master start on. And when I do that, you can see that this all lights up right here. Now is when I put in the measurement. Before I turn any machine on, I want to put in the measurement for how thick my board was. And I was at 0.750. So then I'm going to come to the program, 0.750. The bottom right corner, it's not labeled, but it's that same enter symbol that you see on your keyboard at home. And I hit enter, and then the start button starts to blink. So I push that. I don't know if you can see, but this wheel is spinning pretty furiously fast. I could take and spin that by hand if I wanted to, but on big adjustments, I'll typically let the machine do it. It'll get it right there a little bit quicker than I can, and then I'm not sitting cranking on a wheel. So now this is set at the right thickness. Now I need to power up the machine. So to turn the machine on, I first need to take the parking brake off. Think of it as the parking brake. Every time this gets turned off, the parking brake is set. So if you listen carefully, you hear that little puff, that is the brake being turned off. Now the machine is able to free spin. So I turn the head of the machine on. By pushing the green start button. And I turn the feet on to get my remote out of the way. And now I can put my board through the sand. You probably couldn't hear that, but it just lightly sanded it. I need to take 0.010 of an inch off now. I can type it in here, or I can come back down to the wheel